A 16-year-old running 9.88 seconds in the 100 meters sounds like the kind of performance that should change the sport forever. But there is a problem. The stopwatch doesn't tell the whole story. The number 9.88 is real in the claim being circulated, but the conditions behind that number matter just as much as the number itself. A massive tailwind reportedly pushed the race far beyond the legal limit, meaning the performance could not be ratified as an official record. And yet, that is exactly what makes this story so fascinating. Because if you strip away the wind, you are still left with a teenager running at a level that would have been almost unimaginable for a high school sophomore only a few years ago. This isn't just about one race. It's about how quickly sprinting is changing. For decades, breaking 10 seconds was treated like a barrier reserved for the world's best senior athletes. Then teenagers started getting closer. The records began falling. The expectations changed. And now a new generation is showing up with speed that makes people wonder where the ceiling even is anymore. But there's another question hiding underneath all of this. If young sprinters are getting this fast this early, are we witnessing the next revolution in track and field? Or are we getting carried away by times that don't tell the complete story? To understand that, we have to go back to where this new sprinting era began. For most of track and field history, there was an invisible wall around the 100 meters. 10 seconds. It wasn't an official rule. It wasn't a physical barrier. But psychologically, it was enormous. Running under 10 seconds meant you had entered a different category of athlete. For years, the list of men capable of doing it was incredibly exclusive. These were Olympic champions, world champions, professional stars, and athletes who had spent their entire lives chasing tiny improvements. 1/100th of a second could separate greatness from history. Then something started changing. Young sprinters began pushing closer to the barrier. One of the names that helped change expectations was Trayvon Bromell. In 2014, Bromell ran 9.97 seconds at the NCAA championships, becoming the first junior to officially break 10 seconds. That performance showed that the barrier wasn't reserved exclusively for fully developed professional sprinters. And once one athlete crossed it, the psychological barrier became smaller. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether a young athlete could ever run under 10. The question became, how young could someone do it? That shift created a completely different environment for high school sprinting. Athletes such as Gout began attracting international attention at an incredibly young age. His performances made people rethink what teenagers could accomplish in the 100 and 200 meters. Then came an even more aggressive wave. The 2025 season produced several spectacular high school sprint performances, with names like Tate Taylor, Maurice Gleaton, and Braden Williams entering conversations that previously belonged almost entirely to elite professionals. The numbers were getting faster. But what made the trend particularly fascinating wasn't just the fastest time. It was how many young athletes were suddenly getting close. And that's when the definition of a great high school sprinter started changing. Running 10.1 was no longer viewed in quite the same way. Running 10.0 wasn't automatically enough to shock people. The next generation was beginning to look at sub-10 as something that might actually be within reach. Then another young athlete entered the conversation. Dylan Mitchell. At just 16 years old, Mitchell reportedly produced a 6.59-second performance in the 60 meters at the United States Nationals, a time that immediately attracted attention because of how rare that level of speed is at such a young age. The significance wasn't simply the number. It was the age. 16. A sophomore. Someone who, in the normal progression of a track career, would still be years away from reaching physical maturity. And that is what made his development so intriguing. Sprint performance is complicated. It's not just raw strength. It's acceleration, reaction time, maximum velocity, technique, stride mechanics, coordination, power, and the ability to maintain speed when the body is screaming to slow down. At the elite level, athletes spend years refining those details. So when someone this young begins producing elite-level numbers, people naturally start wondering what could happen if that athlete continues developing. But there was a bigger moment coming. A performance that would make the track world stop and look twice. According to the supplied account, Mitchell stepped onto a Texas track for a smaller meet. There was no massive global championship atmosphere. No Olympic final. No packed stadium waiting for history. Just a teenager, a starting line, and 10 seconds standing between him and one of the most recognizable barriers in sprinting. Then the gun went off. And the clock reportedly stopped at 9.88. For a moment, the number looked almost unbelievable. A high school sophomore. 9.88. But immediately, another number became just as important. The wind. Because the wind reading was reportedly around plus 5.88 meters per second. The legal limit for a record-eligible 100-meter performance is plus 2.0. That means this wasn't simply a slightly favorable breeze. It was far beyond the allowable limit. And that changes everything. The 9.88 cannot simply be placed alongside legal performances and treated as equivalent. It doesn't qualify as a legal record. But here's the strange part. The illegal win doesn't make the performance meaningless. It makes it complicated. Because even if you remove the record from consideration, you're still looking at a teenager producing extraordinary speed. And now the question becomes much more interesting. How fast could Mitchell actually run under legal conditions? That is where the story takes its next turn. The easiest mistake to make with sprinting is to look only at the final number. 9.88. It sounds definitive. But track and field doesn't work that way. Wind matters. A lot. A legal tailwind can help a sprinter, while excessive wind can create conditions that are no longer considered comparable with standard performances. That's why track officials don't simply record every fast time as a legitimate record. There has to be a consistent standard. The maximum allowable tailwind is plus 2.0 meters per second. Anything above that can make a performance ineligible for record purposes. Mitchell's reported plus 5.88 was almost 3 times the legal limit. So the correct way to describe the race isn't. A 16-year-old officially ran 9.88. The more accurate description is. A 16-year-old reportedly ran 9.88 in heavily wind-assisted conditions. That distinction might sound small. It isn't. But here's where things get fascinating. Because the supplied analysis attempts to estimate what the performance could look like with more neutral conditions. And while wind conversions are estimates rather than official replacements for an actual race, they suggest something extraordinary. Even after accounting for the huge tailwind, the performance still points toward an athlete capable of approaching the 10-second barrier. And when the maximum legal tailwind is considered, the estimated equivalent can fall into sub-10 territory. Again, that does not turn the original race into a legal sub-10. Only an actual race run under legal conditions can do that. But it explains why people are paying attention. Because the bigger question isn't whether the 9.88 should become a record. It shouldn't. The bigger question is whether Mitchell is genuinely close to becoming one of the youngest athletes ever to break 10 seconds legally. That possibility is what makes this story so exciting. And it also puts his performance into context with other recent high school stars. The supplied account points to Braden Williams and Maurice Gleaton producing 9.82 performances under illegal wind conditions. Those times were even faster on paper. But they also weren't legal record performances. Meanwhile, the national high school record remains a different matter. The lesson is important. An eye-catching stopwatch time isn't automatically a record. Wind matters. Timing systems matter. Competition level matters. And verification matters. But none of that takes away from the larger trend. High school sprinting is getting frighteningly fast. And this isn't happening in isolation. Across the sport, teenagers are becoming more competitive against older athletes. Some are running elite times. Some are beating experienced competitors. Others are setting age group records that once seemed almost impossible. That's why people keep mentioning athletes like Gout. He became a symbol of the new generation because his performances made it obvious that teenagers could produce elite sprint mechanics long before most people expected. But Mitchell's story adds another layer. Because he isn't being discussed as a distant future prospect. He's being discussed because of what he is already doing. And that changes the conversation. When an athlete is 16, people naturally want to know what happens at 17. Then 18. Then college. Then professional competition. What happens when the body gets stronger? What happens when technique improves? What happens when race experience increases? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the wind is legal? That's the mystery. A wind-assisted 9.88 creates a headline. A legal 9.8 by a 16-year-old would create history. Those are two very different things. And that distinction is why experts and serious fans have to resist the temptation to overreact. The sport doesn't need another exaggerated claim. It needs a clean race. A legal wind. A verified time. And then we can see exactly where Mitchell belongs. Still, there is something undeniable happening. The old timeline for sprint development is being challenged. Athletes are reaching high speeds earlier. The talent pipeline is getting deeper. Training knowledge is improving. Technology is improving. Youth athletes have access to information, coaching, nutrition, strength programs, biomechanics, and competition opportunities that previous generations didn't have at the same age. And all of those factors can contribute to faster development. But there is another side to the story. The faster teenagers get, the more important development becomes. At 16, the goal cannot simply be to chase the fastest possible time every weekend. Sprint careers are long. Bodies need time. Technique needs refinement. And athletes need to learn how to handle pressure. Because once the internet labels you the next superstar, every race becomes a test. A tenth of a second slower becomes a disappointment. An injury becomes a crisis. A bad start becomes a viral clip. And suddenly a teenager isn't simply competing anymore. He's carrying expectations. That may become the biggest challenge of Mitchell's story. Not whether he can run fast. We already know he can. The real question is whether he can develop without being consumed by the hype. And that brings us to the final part of the story. Because if this teenager eventually produces a legal sub-10 performance, the conversation changes completely. Imagine the scene. No massive tailwind. No questionable comparison. No explanation needed. The scoreboard simply shows a legal time beginning with 9. That would be the moment everything changes. Because suddenly, the discussion wouldn't be about potential. It wouldn't be about wind. It wouldn't be about projections. It would be official. A teenager had crossed one of track and field's most famous barriers. And if Mitchell were to do it at 16, the significance would be enormous. But that's also why the current 9.88 needs to be handled carefully. The race is impressive. The conditions make it ineligible. Both things can be true at the same time. That's the part social media often struggles with. People want a simple answer. Was it 9.88? Yes. Was it legal? No. Does that mean the athlete isn't special? Absolutely not. Does it mean we should call it an official sub-10? Also no. The nuance is actually what makes the story more interesting. Because now everyone has a reason to watch the next race. The stopwatch becomes the answer. And if Mitchell steps onto the track under legal conditions and produces another extraordinary performance, the hype suddenly has evidence behind it. That is how legends begin. Not with one viral clip. With repetition. With consistency. With performances that survive different conditions and different competitions. That's what separated the greatest sprinters from everyone else. They didn't run one incredible race. They did it again. And again. And again. The same principle applies to the current generation. Maybe Mitchell becomes one of the next major American sprint stars. Maybe another teenager comes along and runs even faster. Maybe the current wave of young talent completely changes what people consider normal for high school sprinting. And that's perhaps the biggest story hiding underneath this one race. The sport's baseline is moving. Look at how quickly expectations have changed. A few years ago, a high school athlete approaching 10 seconds was extraordinary. Now, multiple young athletes are being discussed in that range. The same thing is happening across other sprint events. Young runners are attacking records. Teenagers are competing against professionals. And the gap between youth and elite competition appears smaller than it once did. That doesn't mean every teenager will become a professional star. In fact, most won't. Development is unpredictable. Injuries happen. Bodies change. Competition gets harder. And the transition from high school to elite track can expose weaknesses that aren't obvious at the youth level. That's why the next few years will matter more than one spectacular afternoon. Mitchell's future will be determined by consistency. How does he handle pressure? How does he improve his start? Can he maintain top-end speed? Can he stay healthy? Can he compete against older, stronger athletes? Can he keep developing when the spotlight gets bigger? Those questions are far more important than a single viral number. And there's another issue worth discussing. When a teenager runs an astonishing time, the attention can become overwhelming. Suddenly, everyone has an opinion. Some people call him the next superstar. Others immediately compare him to established champions. Some say the sport has found its next great talent. Others point to the wind and say the performance doesn't count. The truth is somewhere in between. The performance counts as a sign of potential. The wind means it doesn't count as an official record. Both statements belong in the same conversation. And maybe that's exactly what makes this moment so exciting. We don't know the ending yet. We are watching the beginning. The 9.88 may eventually become a footnote. Or it could become the race people remember as the moment they first noticed a future superstar. Only time will tell. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The next generation of sprinters is coming. And they're coming fast. The sport's old barriers are being challenged earlier than ever. 10 seconds doesn't look as impossible as it once did. And for athletes growing up watching professionals run those times, the psychological barrier may be disappearing completely. That's powerful. Because sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't happen when an athlete gets stronger. They happen when an athlete stops believing a barrier is impossible. For decades, 10 seconds represented something almost mythical. Now teenagers are standing at the edge of it. Some have crossed it illegally. Sooner or later, someone will cross it legally at an age that forces the entire sport to rethink what young sprinters can do. Maybe that athlete will be Dylan Mitchell. Maybe it will be someone we haven't even heard of yet. But if the current trend continues, the next record-breaking performance may already be somewhere on a high school track. And when that legal time finally appears, nobody will care about the wind conversion. Nobody will need an explanation. The clock will say everything. So now I want to hear from you. When you see a 16-year-old produce a performance like this, do you see the beginning of a future superstar, or do you think people are getting too excited before the athlete proves it under legal conditions? And more importantly, how fast do you think the next generation of high school sprinters can realistically go? Because one thing is certain. The sport is changing. The old expectations are disappearing. And the athletes coming through the system are making the impossible look normal. If you enjoyed this documentary-style breakdown, leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you think this new generation is heading. And if you want more stories about the athletes changing track and field, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.